Hey friends, it's Teresa and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be me discussing the books that I read in April. Yes, I almost said May, but May barely began, so sadly I only read 4 books this year. I had maybe 6 or 7 books on my TBR, and then I got one of my loans from my library, which was Hood Feminism, came through. Sadly did not get a chance to finish Hood Feminism before my loan. My borrowing time went away, so it is currently on hold again. I have put a hold on it. And I will read it, I will finish it in 6 to 8 weeks. But thankfully though, this month, the books that I read were they were good and then they were great. So let's just kind of get into it. The first book that I read is The Colt in Her Bones by Peter Nell van Arsdale. This is a YA retelling of Medusa's mythology. This follows a young girl named Milla, who in this village has seen girls disappear for every year, basically. A curse comes through the land, sweeps through, and then transforms these girls into monsters, and these girls are sent away. Milla has somehow avoided this curse because she and her family kind of live on the outskirts of the village. However, that is until one day when a girl from the village comes to live with Milla and her family, that Milla realizes that this curse is it's a bit more of a struggle than she would like, and now she is trying to search for the answers to these questions that she has as to what this curse is and why it took her friend. Trigger warning for this: there is emotional abuse, insects, I know people are scared of insects, snakes, we have sexual abuse, death. I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. I read this on my trip when I was road tripping, which was a very interesting thing to read. I felt that this book was very middle of the road. I love the prose. The prose was absolutely marvelous and descriptive and just imaginative. However, I feel like the actual plot itself not only moved really slowly, but the character growth, which I feel like this book is more character heavy than anything, was just not there at the end of the day. So I was just even at the ending, it was supposed to be kind of a weird happy but not happy ending, but it still felt like nothing really happened to achieve this kind of ending and to get to that point in time. And there's also just it just didn't feel right. The ending and the lead up to the ending just didn't feel right to me. And I don't know. It's a beautiful cover. I love the prose. The premise is wonderful. However, like I said, it's very middle of the road. And right now, I still genuinely do not know how to feel about it. Genuinely don't know how to feel about it. A lot happened. A lot happened in this span of 300 book pages? Not even a full 300 pages. And yet, it felt like nothing had happened. So, do I recommend? Not entirely sure, but it's there. It's good. I guess I would recommend it if you like lyrical prose. Maybe you'll glean more off of this than I will. But how it was written was just very middle of the road. Yeah. The next book is actually an anthology series, and that is Monstrous by Leslie Tenorio. This is an adult anthology series following many lives of Filipino people, either in America or in the Philippines, and it kind of deals with the trauma that we've had to deal with over the years, the trauma that we're still dealing with, as well as the problems within our own society that we have to kind of understand and deal with to this day, is the best way I can describe it. Before we get into it, there are also trigger warnings for this book. There is abandonment, there is transphobic mentions, especially in the first, particularly in the first story. There's also death and then illegal medical practices. At least those were the trigger warnings that I had noticed. But if you all have read this book and you know more that I didn't see, please feel free to let me know. I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this collection. I wanted to keep reading and just kind of try to get an understanding of what exactly was happening in the stories, the overall kind of themes behind it, and what they mean exactly to the larger picture in terms of Filipino culture today and what Filipinos might have had to deal with back in the 60s and 50s. But as all anthology series, there's always 1 or 2 stories that I don't really connect with. I forget which ones were the ones that I didn't particularly connect with. I think it was there was one about the Beatles. I believe mine was Help, and then Felix Staro, which is the second and then I think the third to last stories in this collection. But other than that, I really enjoyed this book collection. It was absolutely marvelous, and I'm trying to see if I can find any other of Leslie Tenorio's work, because his writing is done in such a way where he deals with these really heavy and kind of depressing topics, but does it in a way that's that's easier to digest and almost a little bit more lighthearted with some of the humor that he introduces into the stories. Highly recommend it, and it's definitely going to be on one of my lists of books that's going to be probably a favorite of 2021, if I'm being completely honest. The next book, slash the second to last book in my wrap up, is actually a book you guys have heard me mention. I have, in fact, done a review on it, and it's spoiler free, so I'll leave it linked down below. But that is Grown by Tiffany D. Jackson. This is a YA contemporary novel. It's a pretty new one. It was released, I think, September 2020, December 2020, around that time frame. Like I said, it's a YA contemporary novel following young Enchanted who wants to be nothing more than a singer. She has the voice for it, she has the talent to write these beautiful lyrical songs, and that's all she wants to do. But first, her parents want her to focus on school to kind of have a fallback plan, as most parents want their children to have. However, one day she enters a singing competition, and while she does not get a chance to actually compete, she does catch the eye of Corey Fields, who is a pretty well-known R&B artist. And there, Corey promises to tutor her and help her rise to stardom, and Enchanted puts everything she has into it and does what she can to get there without really realizing that maybe Corey has some pretty sinister ideas in mind. And then one day, she wakes up to find Corey dead in the home, and she's one of the few people in the apartment that night, and all the police think she's the one who did it. So this is Enchanted's journey of trying to piece together what exactly happened that night and the events leading up to it. Now, trigger warnings for this book: there is sexual assault, there is physical assault as well, abuse, addiction to opioids, pedophilia, gaslighting, and emotional and mental manipulation. Now, some of these are written in the first couple of pages in here that tell you exactly like what the trigger warnings are and the content warnings, but I decided to add a couple extra just in case. I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars, and I mentioned in my review, which I will leave linked down below, which you guys should watch, I gave this a pretty low 5, and not because of anything quite terrible that happened. I actually really enjoyed this book. I think the way that Tiffany D. Jackson wrote it really humanized and gave Enchanted a voice, and a really wonderful way of showing us what exactly happened to her, and a very lyrical way to do it at that. However, my biggest issue, which I won't get into, is the ending. It felt very, very rushed, and I feel like there wasn't enough time to develop all the kind of plot things that Tiffany D. Jackson had in mind. Had she had maybe given the book like a couple extra, I want to say like 50 pages, we might have gotten that development, but we did not, and it was a very confusing time. Which is very, like, I know y'all are saying, Teresa get confused so easily, so like maybe it's just like user error, but it does feel very rushed because I remember sitting there just wondering how things happened by the time the book had ended. Then there was a weird mystery aspect that was introduced a little too late in the game. But other than that, I really enjoyed this. I will be picking up more of Tiffany D. Jackson's works. I believe Lisa wants me to read Monday's Not Coming, but I could be wrong because I am very forgetful. So if I did forget it and I mentioned the wrong book, I'll throw it on the screen which one she wanted me to read. But I highly recommend it. Like I said, the writing is absolutely lyrical and gorgeous. It's done so succinctly, but so lyrically that everything is described and you can see and visualize everything that's going on without it like really kind of telling you what's happening. I highly recommend it, but like if you are not in the right mindset, please do not read it because it's a very heavy book, and like the entire time I was reading, my fight or flight instincts were like just going off. So please do wary. But if you are in the right mindset, I highly recommend. And the last book that I read in April was actually a buddy with my friend Andrea and I. Somehow, she started the book later than I did, but then finished it earlier than I did. That book is I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter by Erika L. Sanchez. This is a YA contemporary novel following young Julia, who is trying to make sense of the world after her sister's death. That is until she finds a couple of things in her sister's room that makes her question if she knew her sister at all. So this sends her not really spiraling, but down a path where she tries to figure out who her sister was, very much against her parents' wishes, where she's already not the family favorite because she's not exactly what her mother would have wanted a Mexican daughter to be like. Now, trigger warnings, and there's a lot, so I'm gonna just... If there was a book that needed trigger warnings at the front cover, this would be this book. Because Andrew and I were both reading it and trying to discuss trigger warnings for our individual wrap-ups, and we were like, so there were some instances in this book where we were like, the heck? And that's coming from Andrea herself, who doesn't even really concern herself with trigger warnings, and she's like, yeah, I needed trigger warnings. So, Let me just pull up a bullet journal here. Okay. So trigger warnings: depression, death of a sibling, suicide or suicide attempt, self-harm, sexual assault of a child, rape, death/shooting, death of an animal, mentions of homophobia, controlling parents, discussions about abortion. Oh, and infidelity. I ended up giving this a 4 to 5 stars. I found that this was very much like The Cold Is Not in Her Bones. It's a very lyrical and dense kind of writing style, a lot of descriptions, which works in this instance because Julia is depressed. So for her to be underwater and just to be thinking all these thoughts all the time made a lot of sense. I found that this is very, from what I have heard and what I have experienced from having friends who are Mexican, this is very similar to their own experiences with their own parents and just not fitting in. It's written grief and depression in such a beautiful and lyrical way, and we see how Julia kind of slowly descends into a more depressed state as the book progresses because of how everything's working and how everything is kind of panning out in the books. I honestly thought it was a beautiful way to conceptualize grief and depression through this writing style and this kind of mythology of like trying to make sense of your sibling and also trying to find comfort in people who are not really well equipped to comfort themselves. The reason why I gave this a 4 to 5 stars is another kind of similar thing to what happened to The Cold Is Not in Her Bones. I feel like a lot had happened in the book, but due to the writing, the very dense writing style and the kind of the very dense writing style, it made it very difficult for me to figure out exactly what had happened at the end of the book. It's very character driven, it's a very character driven novel. However, I feel like with the writing style exactly, it took away from whatever character growth that we had from Julia, and it also had a lot of empty holes left with plot lines that were introduced about like halfway through the book. So overall, do I recommend it? Yes, I can definitely see the merit because it did win a National Book Award. It was a National Book Award finalist. But overall, there was just a lot of density that kept me from really marinating in what was meant to be happening and the growth that was supposed to be happening with Julia and her family and the grieving process. But that is it for the books that I read in the month of April. If you guys have read these books or plan to read these books, please let me know. Any reviews that I have will be left in the description. And if you guys want me to read any other books, just let me know in the comments and I'll go ahead and prioritize that for next month. But until next time, hit like, subscribe, comment, and I'll talk to you guys in my next video, which will be my vlog. But I hope you guys are having a wonderful week, and if not, hopefully the week gets better for you. Until next time, bye!